Welcome, Melanie, and thank you.
Thank you very much, and very nice to see some familiar faces as well. No pressure. Just to say that I was here for the Creative Case Symposium on Monday, so my talk is largely about exploring the idea of having many hats, but a kind of central core vision, both as a practitioner, as an artist, as someone who's creative, but I'll also be offering some responses to the creative case and some of the discussions, some of the audience comments that came through on Monday. So on the screen you can see a photograph, quite a classic one, of Astaire and Rogers, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. And the idea is that Let's Face the Music and Dance, which was one of the classic one of the classic songs that they performed to, it was very much a depression song. And the idea of it was to offer some kind of inspiration, some kind of hope, some kind of way out of the Great Depression. And the reason I like the phrase, let's face the music and dance, is partly because I think it very much reflects contemporary times. There's very much this kind of sense of the kind of adage, you know, feel the fear, get over your depression, work through things. And I suppose for me, it's this idea of things being cyclical, that however much we might think that the past has left us, things seem to come round. We're in different regimes, we're in different phases, but somehow the issues remain the same. I also like the idea as well of let's face the music and dance, because it's a cross-arts formula. The idea was that both Astaire and Rogers, they were Renaissance men and women. They had the idea of fashion. They were good performers. They danced, they sang. And I suppose there's the kind of tendency these days to segment the arts, to kind of split them together, and then to have the kind of banding of cross-arts where somehow they fuse together. And I suppose I wanted to provoke and sort of say, if someone is good at their craft, then surely they can explore being multifaceted. They can explore fusing art forms, and perhaps they don't then have to be so steadfast about making such pains to talk about the separation. The idea as well about the show must go on came very much through the phase, let's face the music and dance. It was this idea of resilience. Again, this kind of theme keeps coming through in contemporary times, this idea of kind of bearing through the hard times. But also it was overshadowing and it was covering over all the other aspects of art forms that were going on during that time. You know, whilst Astaire and Rogers were in the limelight, there were many other artists who were very much overshadowed, who very much couldn't get resources, who weren't filmed, who were passed over for projects. And I suppose there's always this idea of status, like who actually comes to the fore, who's overshadowed, who we choose and who we select, who's kind of in our gaze and who's in our vision. So moving on to that, we have three images. There's Louis Jourdan and the Timpani Five at the top, and at the same time that Astaire and Rogers were doing a number of different ensemble films together, we have in Harlem, Louis Jourdan and his Timpani Five and his dancers having a very different scenario. At the time, things were very buoyant for them, but certainly they weren't being filmed or promoted in the same way that Astaire and Rogers were. And again, this becomes an issue, I suppose, about race, about equality, about opportunity. But then when you look below at the two pictures of the women, things were even more stark in terms of gender. On the left-hand side, you have Tenderloin. She was an exotic dancer and known for vigorous shaking, which she kind of made into her own art form. But interestingly enough, in the 20s and the 30s, she was the first woman of colour, and I believe as well the first woman to have set up her own nightclub, which was on 52nd Street. Again, this wasn't really made any fuss of, there was no kind of headlines about it, but I like the idea of the artist also being entrepreneurial, also setting up the kind of machinations and processes which help to secure some kind of steady future. And again, I think it's that kind of issue that we often talk about artists in the context of showcases, but we don't often talk about the processes and the machinations which might support artists, or we don't talk about artists also potentially having the kind of innovation or business head which might then develop things that sustain and develop. And then you have on the right-hand side Anna May Wong, who was the first Chinese-American actress to ever get to the fore. And interestingly enough, during that era, she was passed over for many roles about Chinese issues, which were set in China. And I believe it was a German actress who got one of the famous roles, which was set in China about a Chinese family. And I think she actually spent a whole year rehearsing and spending time in China, Anna May Wong, and then at the last minute was passed over by MGM. So it just goes to show that the reality of situations and the reality of where things are staged and where things are positioned can be very different. So I'd like to draw your attention now to a couple of quotes. The Ralph Ellison quote, to me, very much harked to the quote that was mentioned by Kwame Kwei-Armah on Monday, this idea of invisibility. I am a man of substance and bone, fibre and liquids, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am invisible, understand simply because people refuse to see me. And this idea that he spoke about, this idea of invisibility, I feel kind of very much kind of foreshadows some of the issues that were coming out on Monday. There seemed to be a lot of questions and queries in the audience, and I guess it was about each of those individuals perhaps focusing on their area of diversity and feeling invisible. So you sometimes wonder whether these kind of issues kind of flagged up again, whether they suggest that person's particular take on their invisibility or whether it suggests a wider invisibility which has to be addressed. And then going on to the second quote, revolution is the festival of the oppressed by Germaine Greer. I suppose, although I like the quote, it was also the idea of festivals these days being perhaps much more about being drunk, much more about kind of the congregation having a really good time. And I suppose for me, maybe it sort of slightly sullied the idea of, you know, the importance of revolution, the importance of the kind of communal suddenly becoming a festival where everyone has kind of fun. And I guess I wanted to kind of look at the play on that. That then comes to this idea, I guess, of what I've been talking about in terms of people having a whole range of different sources, or what I refer to as found materials, which shapes their notion of diversity. And I guess it's really important to note, because we're not all coming from the same place. We have vastly different backgrounds, even in this room. And it's this idea of, you know, what is your particular take on diversity? How has it come about? Do you see yourself as integrally diverse, or do you see yourself working with a diverse group of people? Or is it a combination of all of those things? You know, are you diverse in terms of the way that you practice your art, or are you diverse in terms of having a diversity of art forms through which you work through? And I suppose I was just flagging up some of the, I would say, the found materials that have informed my work and which are kind of recurring motifs. You know, this idea on the top left, it's not that I have a particular fondness for Dan Antopolsky, although I really love his work. It's more about Dan Antopolsky, to me, representing the surreal or the slightly off-key, which to me is very much a kind of recurring theme. And then in the middle, the top, they're called Moko Jumbis, and they are stilt walkers, harking from Trinidad. And for me, being someone who's half Trinidadian, I always have that kind of reference to the Caribbean, but specifically to Trinidad, and this idea of the play and the masquerade. And then you get on the top right-hand corner, the Marx Brothers, because for me, this idea of the uproarious, gregarious kind of fun and rough and tumble is very much a part of my work. Bringing Up Baby happens to be one of my favorite films, but I like it because it's very screwball and because it explores love in an off-key way. Books have always been a recurring part in terms of, you know, being a voracious reader, but also loving words being presented to me in lots of different ways. And then if you get the sort of top corner, that was a modern love show that we did in 2001. And for me, it was possibly the time when I was like my most innocent, but also perhaps my most primed to really try and explore what I wanted to do artistically. And it was this idea of intertwined artists all expressing their take on love and relationships in the 21st century through prose and through poetry and through movement. And I guess that kind of photo shoot that we spent a lot of time on, to me, kind of captured a decade of the new millennium and a new possibility. And I suppose it's that kind of thing of looking on almost 10 years on, like, you know, where are we with this new possibility? How much has it moved on? So I had the Ralph Ellison quote before, but I suppose I now want to kind of move it alongside and perhaps explore it in terms of this Danish proverb of, it is possible to light another man's candle without damaging our own. And I suppose I wanted to explore this idea of, you know, is it either or? Is your particular take on diversity mutually exclusive from someone else's? You know, is diversity best expressed through connecting our own takes on diversity and trying to make them stronger? Because I guess part of the tone that I got on Monday was this sense of it being an either or, being a kind of sense of a focus on African arts, which kind of came through the question, or a focus on disability, a focus on gender, or a focus on race. And I suppose there's this sense of almost like a diversity competition happening, a sort of who wants to be a millionaire diversity where, you know, people are competing against each other. You know, what happens if you have more than one diversity, you know, aspect to yourself? Like, you know, what do you prioritize? And I suppose I just want to, I provoke and say that I don't think it is a question of either or. I think, if anything, if we become mutually exclusive, we weaken the whole structure. And then this global image, to me is particularly poignant because I feel that the arts sector is so small, you know, it's so small in relation to all the issues around the globe, and I suppose it's just kind of bringing attention to that. That sometimes we see, you know, this thing like subsuming our whole world, but actually, you know, we're a small facet of socioeconomic and political society, and, you know, we need to perhaps think bigger. I often commission artists to respond to things, and I'm sometimes amazed by perhaps, you know, at times the lack of breadth, but also this idea of them not wanting to explore issues around, say, environment and ecology and things which affect the everyday. And it's this idea of, you know, how can we more willingly and more interestingly engage with all the issues around us? And then I put the idea of entitlement there because I have a cousin, and he's half African-American and half Jamaican. And as a young boy, he would kind of look at me kind of reading, and he would almost like get a kind of emotional headache from seeing like all the books and all the kind of stuff around me, because his mother would actually tell him that reading wasn't for black boys, you know, that reading wasn't his right, and that actually, you know, if he was reading, it made him white. And as a result of that, he spent the next few years kind of totally avoiding books. And so I suppose for me, it was interesting that we're in the same family, but there are different cultures existing. And I felt so sad that somehow he didn't feel that he was entitled to the globe, entitled to the world, and entitled to exploring, you know, as much as possible and having that kind of vista around him. So it just goes to show that, you know, sometimes those informed decisions can affect, you know, how you see the world and how you see yourself within the world. So going on to the famous and very controversial Cameron speech, which was in February this year, where he inferred that multiculturalism isn't working. And there's a little clip there from The Independent, who were very disturbed, as were many people, about this idea of multiculturalism suddenly being completely flawed because there were certain issues wrong with it. And I suppose I wanted to question whether, because something has flaws and something in a way is perhaps humanly flawed, whether it needs to be thrown out altogether. It just seemed to me like if there are so many communities within England, within regions and within cities that are harmoniously coexisting, and there are a few things kind of going wrong with multiculturalism, obviously very important things going which need to be tackled, whether it suggests that the whole thing was inherently flawed, or whether it just suggested that certain refinements and certain obligations of government and civic responsibility needed to kind of be sorted out. And then this juxtaposed then with, a few months later, Boris Johnson having a jolly old time at the carnival with dancers. And he was suggesting that multiculturalism were working, you know, fine and okay, and was absolutely happy that kind of weekend. And it was just that idea of, you know, a few months before everything was tragic about multiculturalism, and suddenly, you know, you meet a few dancers and everything's okay. And I suppose it was that idea of, you know, it seems like a dysfunctional relationship, like a sort of on-off relationship with multiculturalism. And I suppose for me, it's kind of questioning the kind of long-term aspect and the long-term responsibility that we have with multiculturalism, this idea of a kind of continuous flow and refining it as we go along. And then on the right-hand side, obviously, we then had within the kind of that, the shadow of looting. Obviously, that's a photoshopped image. They weren't stealing little toy houses. And kind of what that meant for society and what the repercussions of that are. And then down below, we have the image which Cameron was very embarrassed about the Bullingdon Club, which again suggests that our origins and our found materials can very much shape our views and our commitment to certain issues, and that includes diversity. And I suppose for me, I was questioning this kind of current model of diversity I see coming through, which is very much about other, which is very much about a utilitarian or functional model, which is very detached, as opposed to something that I would call for, which is more nuanced, which is more expansive, and which is more connected. So in terms of me offering insights then on my particular take on diversity, well, I think curiosity is so important in terms of expanding one's kind of vista, as I was talking about, this idea of being open and responsive. I think if it's not core or embedded, and I don't think it matters what background you are, I think it's just about taking whatever aspect of diversity that's comfortable to you or which, you know, you can relate to, and embedding it at the core and then working it from there. If you embed it, you can always refine it, you can always tweak it, you can always come back to it later. If you don't embed it, you probably don't know where it is when something goes wrong. And then the idea of the long-term view, you know, hopefully some of the slides I've been showing you have suggested that there seems to be a lot of short-termism. We don't know where the kind of current government regime and even the arts regimes are going to be taking us in the next few years. So maybe it's about us trying to have a long-term view while things are being worked out. And then this ability to refine, as I say, this idea of being fit for purpose, fit for your purpose, fit for the artist's purpose that you might be engaging with, and fit for everybody's purpose where possible. This is my kind of notion of diversity. It's both in and out. So this is the kind of teams that I work with, both of producers, of interns, of fellow curators and producers. This was at a festival that we did last year through the company I run, Tilt. And the idea of it was that we have kind of long-term development, we have ways of supporting each other, and we have internships which can develop then into kind of producing responsibilities, producing opportunities, and this idea of the flow, kind of supporting people in a kind of cradle-to-grave approach. Just a few quotes that I like, this idea of art being in the gap, as well as within it. And this idea of Chinua Achebe, again, exploring the notion of other. This was another photo of Renaissance 1 writers, this idea of the kind of collective work. This is the idea of our kind of income streams, that we've developed kind of new income streams as an independent company with no core funding. And then just some photos to round off, just showing some of the projects. Again, as you can say, it's very much about us encouraging and supporting multiple voices. Okay, thank you. Okay.